That's awful behavior. That should never happen, regardless of somebody's faith context, and that's wrong. Hello, Saints. My name is Jeff. I'm a pastor in Utah, exploring everything I can about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And in this video, I'd like to explore this question. Do I believe that Protestant evangelicals owe members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints an apology? An apology for what, you might ask? Well, we're going to get into all that. And what if I told you that over 20 years ago, a gathering of Protestant evangelicals and Latter-day Saints in the Tabernacle in Salt Lake City resulted in one of the most controversial moments when it comes to Protestant evangelical and Latter-day Saint relationships, when a prominent evangelical stood in front of a crowd of Latter-day Saints and offered an apology. Here's a sneak peek of this. We're not going to talk about it too much right now. This is what I'm referring to.
Indeed, let me state the case bluntly on this important occasion, especially to you LDS folks who are here this evening. We evangelicals have sinned against you.
So we'll revisit this in just a minute when it comes to really answering this question. Do we owe one another an apology? But before we do, let's talk a little bit more about why an apology might be in order. First of all, I think it's no secret to anyone that there is a long history of tension between Protestant evangelicals and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I mean, let's go all the way back to the beginning of the LDS Church. We're talking around 1830s. It didn't take long for them to have to migrate out of New York because of how it was being received by the locals. They ended up in Ohio, and they were sending people to Missouri. I mean, if you check the history books, there's actually something called the Missouri Mormon War that took place in 1838. There were a lot of locals who were not comfortable with the Latter-day Saint presence there, and most of those locals were Protestants, and there were a few other political motivations probably tied to some of the discomfort, but it all centered around this religious group. And it went so far as even the governor of Missouri putting a Mormon extermination order in place to get Latter-day Saints out of Missouri. Joseph Smith was jailed in Missouri for a while before he ended up in Nauvoo, where, again, there were lots of tensions with the locals, primarily because of the religious convictions and practices. And it led to the arrest of Joseph Smith, the one who established the church, and even his death by a mob. And after all of this, the next leader, Brigham Young, took all the saints out west to unincorporated territory. It wasn't even a state yet, in the area that is now known as Utah and the Intermountain West. And there, Latter-day Saints were able to practice what they believed, and they grew for many years. And even though there was a separation from direct conflict with Protestants, that doesn't mean that that tension ever went away. And this is another area to consider, this sort of ongoing marginalization, the stigma attached to Latter-day Saints as they are completely otherly or fringe, that their beliefs are heretical, not in line with a traditional understanding of what the Bible teaches. You don't have to go far than a Latter-day Saint temple or something we've talked about multiple times on this channel, the general conference gatherings that take place twice a year in Salt Lake City with Latter-day Saints. You will frequently see Protestant evangelicals outside protesting, speaking against the church, or handing out tracts or trying to have conversations with Latter-day Saints with the motivation of helping Latter-day Saints seeing where Protestants believe they are in error. And again, as I've talked about in other videos, where a lot of those Protestant evangelicals might be well-meaning and well-intended, some of them can get pretty abrasive when it comes to the street preaching. And even though those very loud street preachers only represent a very small percentage of Protestant evangelicals, when you pair that with this historic tension that has existed that we just talked about, a lot of Latter-day Saints walking into General Conference, hearing these street preachers, maybe even being approached by calm individuals who are handing out tracts, are going to perceive that as not just protest, but persecution. That their beliefs are being persecuted, that their culture is being persecuted, that their community is being persecuted. And when they walk into the conference center and they are with their people hearing from their leaders, which feels like a safe haven compared to the individuals outside, even though it's not the 1830s, there's still very much a tension there. Another thing that's important to point out is how there has been a shift in recent years in the Latter-day Saint posture when it comes to being a little bit less inward focused, a little less insular. The LDS Church has done a lot to push outward with even various callings to help foster healthy interfaith relationships. And where Latter-day Saints, to their credit, have done a really great job graciously and kindly reaching across faith lines to make faith connections, it's not always well received, which just sort of adds to this dynamic where Latter-day Saints, I think, oftentimes feel rejected, sort of subjugated to a certain extent. So that sense of maybe even a cultural rejection within Christendom doesn't help matters, especially when it's tied to certain messaging that can be very confusing and off-putting to Latter-day Saints. When a Protestant evangelical might look at what Latter-day Saints claim, believe, or even teach and say, well, this is so far away from what we believe the Bible teaches. These are such different ideas about God and about Jesus. We don't even believe that you're a Christian, or you believe in a different Jesus. This is the type of messaging that exists in this space that makes it very difficult to even see if it's possible for Protestants and evangelicals to ever in some way have an amicable relationship or connection with one another within Christendom. There's also certain things that have just been not very clear to Protestant evangelicals as to whether or not Latter-day Saints are part of Christianity or whether they're something different. Because I've talked to plenty of older individuals, whether they're Latter-day Saint or non-Latter-day Saint, who say that for a while Latter-day Saints didn't really want to consider themselves part of Christendom, that they were their own thing. There was the I Am Mormon campaign that was just a few years ago, right before things changed. And that nickname was set aside for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. That can be confusing to some of us, so that when we try to engage in conversations and we're treated as though we're trying to insult, when really, sometimes there's just not a lot of clarity. Even the conversation that I have more than any other, that Latter-day Saints say that we are Christian and we believe in the same Jesus. Yet I'll hear stories from pastors here in Utah who have students who have attended their church and who have decided to leave the LDS faith and be baptized into a Protestant church or Roman Catholic context, and as a result have been expelled from BYU for not maintaining ecclesiastical endorsements and following certain parts of the honor code. And that can be very confusing to us because we know that Protestants are allowed to go to BYU and Catholics and maybe even Muslims and Jews. There can't even be atheists that go to BYU. As long as they have an ecclesiastical endorsement, they're allowed to attend. But if someone leaves the LDS church and leaves their membership behind, it's really caused problems with individuals maintaining their enrollment at BYU. That can be very confusing to us because if we are all Christian and we all believe in the same Jesus, why would somebody going from a Latter-day Saint paradigm into a Protestant evangelical paradigm be cause for expulsion? There's probably answers for all of these things, but if we're not honest with one another about where there have been certain infractions or certain lack of clarity as it pertains to the tensions that exist between us, things can get really messy. And I'd like to pivot for a minute into reasons as to why Protestant evangelicals might feel that Latter-day Saints owe them an apology to a certain extent. And I know that might be a little confusing to some Latter-day Saints, but let me explain. When Joseph Smith, at the offset of this whole movement, said that he had an encounter with two personages, Heavenly Father and Jesus Christ, and it was communicated that all of the other Christian denominations were wrong and that all of their creeds were an abomination, to speak to the fundamental core beliefs that are not only passionately held by Protestant evangelicals, but reach so far back into our spiritual heritage, that's something that, as you can understand, isn't going to set right. In other words, we didn't really get started off on the right foot here. Beyond that, claims of the LDS Church being the one true church. There have been claims made in the past that all of the Protestant evangelical churches and different pastors who try to engage in conversations with Latter-day Saints are just part of the great spacious building out of the Book of Mormon, and we're just scoffing and making fun of. I'm not sure if that's always a fair statement to make, or that the churches outside of the LDS Church, whether they be Roman Catholic or Protestant, are the church spoken about in the Book of Mormon as the Church of Satan, because there's only one Church of Jesus Christ. Those are just some overall beliefs that I have had leverage in my direction, not to mention some of the things that have happened with people that I know that grew up in Utah who are non-Latter-day Saints, and Latter-day Saint parents would not let these Protestant kids play with their kids. They would be ostracized at school. There's one individual in particular that was part of a book club with Latter-day Saint women and was really enjoying it. And as soon as those women found out that she wasn't a Latter-day Saint, they kicked her out of the group. Now, all of these things I know are indicative of any group in any area where there's concentration, where consensus might misbehave and treat those who aren't a part of that broader group the best. I'm not saying the church teaches these things, but I would say that Protestant evangelical Christianity doesn't teach that extermination orders should be in place for Latter-day Saints in the 1830s. I'm not trying to sidestep responsibility because I do think, personally, there are certain ways in which certain Protestant evangelicals have regarded Latter-day Saints that I think is wrong, and I think apologies are in store. For example, a Latter-day Saint shared with me that when they were on their mission in Florida, they would have to keep their eyes open when they were on the street because there was a local Protestant youth pastor who would get the kids from his youth group in a car, and they would play a game where they would drive around looking for Latter-day Saint missionaries, and they would act like they're going to hit them with their car and at the last second swerve away. And it was really terrifying to these young men who were on their mission. I think 99.9% of Protestant evangelicals would say that's awful behavior. That should never happen, regardless of somebody's faith context, and that's wrong. That being said, I think that that's more of an exception to the type of behavior that we're talking about than the rule. So where there are some misbehaving individuals in both of our paradigms that do things that are in no way, shape, or form reflective of the faith we claim to hold, if we're going to step into that sacred space of our faith convictions and our spiritual heritage, rather than just saying, I'm sorry, and moving on, I think we need to talk things out a little bit more. So all of this sets the stage to what I was referring to earlier, this moment in 2004 that was unprecedented to a certain extent. When you had prominent Latter-day Saints like Steve Robinson and Robert Millett interfacing with prominent Protestant evangelicals like Craig Blomberg and Richard Mouw. These were individuals that were sort of at the center of scholarship and academia in their respective faith paradigms. And they got together. Not only did a couple of them write a book together called How Wide the Divide, but then there was this gathering in 2004 where a Protestant evangelical speaker who was very popular at the time was invited to speak at the Tabernacle in Salt Lake City. And all of these individuals who had been involved for the last number of years in this sort of interfaith effort between Protestants and Latter-day Saints came together to welcome this Protestant speaker. And before he spoke, a prominent evangelical named Richard Mouw, who was the president of Fuller Theological Seminary at the time, offered these comments, and it got a lot of attention.
It's difficult for me to find adequate words to express how thrilled I am to be here this evening. Here we are, evangelical Protestants and members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, gathered together in this Salt Lake Tabernacle for an event that's described as an evening of friendship. I'm not being melodramatic when I say that this is surely an historic occasion. To be sure, there have long been friendships between some evangelicals and some LDS folks, but they have not typically appeared on the public radar screen. Our public relations between our two communities have been, to put it mildly, decidedly unfriendly. From the very beginning, when Joseph Smith organized this church in 1830, my evangelical forebears hurled angry accusations and vehement denunciations against the Mormon community, a practice that continues from some evangelical quarters even in this present day. And I think it's fair to say that some Mormons have on occasion responded in kind. Friendship with each other has not come easily for our two communities. But in recent times, things have begun to change. On a personal level, over the past half a dozen years, I've been a member of a small group of evangelical scholars who have been engaged in lengthy closed-door discussions with a small group of our LDS counterparts. We've not been afraid to argue strenuously with each other, but our arguments have been conducted, I think it's fair to say, in a sincere desire genuinely to understand each other, and in the process, we have formed some deep bonds of friendship. I know I've learned much from this continuing dialogue, and I'm now convinced that we evangelicals have often seriously misrepresented the beliefs and practices of the Mormon community. Indeed, let me state the case bluntly on this important occasion, especially to you LDS folks who are here this evening. We evangelicals have sinned against you. The God of the Scriptures makes it clear that it is a terrible thing to bear false witness against our neighbors. And we have been guilty of that sort of transgression and things that we've said about you. We've told you what you believe without making a sincere effort, first of all, to ask you what you believe. We made much of the need to provide you with a strong defense of traditional Christian convictions, regularly quoting the Apostle Peter's mandate that we present to people like you a reasoned account of the hope that lies within us, but we have not been careful to follow the same apostle's counsel that immediately follows that mandate when he tells us that we must always make our case with gentleness and reverence toward those with whom we are speaking. Indeed, we have even on occasion demonized you, weaving conspiracy theories about what the LDS is really trying to accomplish in the world. And even at our best, we have, and this is true of both of our communities, we have talked past each other. I formed some wonderful friendships with Mormons in the past few years. These friends have helped me to see the ways in which I have often misinterpreted Mormon thought. To be sure, as a result of these conversations, I also remain convinced that there are very real issues of disagreement between us, and that some of these issues are matters of eternal significance. But we can now discuss these topics as friends.
Okay, so I want to stop it right there because there were more things that Dr. Mao shared about Protestant, Evangelical, and Latter-day Saint relationships, and I'll put a link in the description below if you want to watch the entire discussion. But I just want to examine his comments just for a second. Because on one hand, it seemed like a really healthy gesture of reconciliation from a Protestant evangelical in a Latter-day Saints house, if you will, the tabernacle. And in one sense, I think that's what Richard Mao was desiring to do. It was an olive branch of sorts. It was saying, listen, we brought down the temperature in the room a little bit after generations of fighting. Thank you for having us. We want to acknowledge some of the things that might have gotten in the way of this happening sooner. However, it's really important for me to point out that there were a lot of Protestant evangelicals, specifically pastors in Utah, that were really uncomfortable with some of those comments. And here's a few reasons why. First of all, it's very difficult for any one person to apologize on behalf of one large group of people if they are not technically the spokesperson or the leader of that organization. And when we're talking about Protestant Christianity or even evangelical Christianity, we are talking about dozens and dozens of organizations that have different ecclesiastical structures and leadership. So for one individual representing the diversity of all of those groups, talking to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and offering that apology, it just didn't go over too well. And I think that's where Dr. Mao might have ran into some issues. He was conflating these behind closed door, personal, very relationship-centric conversations he was having with people in the LDS world, and he was kind of bringing that out and blending it with his thoughts and sentiments, and then speaking on behalf of all Protestant evangelicals. I think that's what was going on there, even though he was well-intended, but it kind of does make sense why there were a lot of individuals who felt that it wasn't his place to speak on behalf of Protestant evangelicals. So all of this probably gives you an indication on how I would answer this question. Do I believe Protestant evangelicals owe Latter-day Saints an apology? I don't think I can speak to that as one individual because there are too many nuances. There's too much history. There are too many layers to the offenses that one person can just speak to and sort of wipe it all away. Now, I do agree with Dr. Mao and a lot of the individuals that were probably there that night that we can do better when it comes to interfaith dialogue. There, I think I do align with him. The question is, how do we do that? If anything, I think one of the biggest infractions Protestant evangelicals have committed against Latter-day Saints that we need to think about is where we strawman the arguments of individuals who don't believe the same way we do. And if you need some clarification on what a strawman argument is, it's something found in philosophy and logic. It's actually considered a fallacy. It's when you take something and you reduce it so much so that you explain it to someone in a way that is kind of demeaning and isn't even representative of the other person's point of view. So let me give you an example. I believe that the best sport in existence is the sport of hockey. It's amazing. And people who have disagreed with me have used straw man arguments to say, why would you like a sport where all people do is try to hit a little black thing in the net and beat each other up? I'm sorry, but as someone who has played hockey and who is a huge hockey fan, let's go Blues, that's just never how I would explain what hockey is. There's so much more to it. So when somebody in a Protestant evangelical world reduces Latter-day Saint belief to say, oh, they're the people that are just wanting to become the god of their own planet one day and they want to practice polygamy, I'm sorry, but not only is that a gross simplification of certain teachings found in the Latter-day Saint paradigm, but that's just not even how a Latter-day Saint would articulate their beliefs. For example, there was a film that came out back in the 70s and 80s, you might have heard of it, called The God Makers. It was an evangelical attempt to put together sort of a presentation of what Latter-day Saints believe. And though the claims made in The God Makers weren't baseless, they came from various aspects and sources of Latter-day Saint teaching throughout the history of the church. It was a sensationalized description of various teachings found in the Latter-day Saint paradigm. I think ways that we can do better is when we take a steelman approach. A steelman approach is the opposite of straw man. It's when somebody who holds a different belief than somebody else articulates that belief and does everything they can to speak about it in the most accurate terms as possible. To the extent that the person who actually holds that belief would say, man, that was a really accurate way of saying that. In fact, you said it in a way that I kind of wish I would have said it. From there, we have just established respect and dignity in a way that we can have some really effective conversation. It's the type of conversation that I think a lot of people are longing for here in 2025 in a lot of different paradigms, in conversations on social issues or racial issues, or even in political spheres. For us to just reduce and demean one another never leads anywhere productive. And I think that's what Richard Mao was getting at. And I also think that it's something that Latter-day Saints and evangelicals can both strive toward. To do everything we can to accurately, with respect, understand the other person, even if we might adamantly or passionately disagree with them. There's been a couple resources recently that I'd love to point to that might give you some insight into how this can be done well. First of all, pertaining to the God Makers and a way to sort of rethink the Protestant evangelical posture as it pertains to the creation and use of that video, I've linked in the description a blog post from a good friend of mine named Kyle Bashirs. He is a Protestant evangelical pastor in Alabama, and he did a fantastic job having an honest conversation about God Makers and how we can and probably should take a different approach when it comes to understanding and interacting with one another. And if you want to see it case in point too, from somebody who's not in the Hello Saints world, there's a Protestant evangelical pastor in California named Gavin Ortlund who has a YouTube channel called Truth Unites, does an amazing job. He's one of these guys that I would probably agree with 99.9% of the time. He's in my camp. I'm in his tribe. We're part of the same people. He does a really good job articulating different beliefs within Protestant Christianity or with Roman Catholics or Orthodox. And just recently had a conversation with somebody who's been on this channel, Jacob Hansen, and they discussed the Trinity. And I think it was a really good demonstration of going into a conversation knowing we're probably not going to agree, but let's understand one another. Let's steelman each other's positions and arguments, and then have a healthy dialogue from there. I think this is part of the forward movement, or I would even say a shared vision that we can have moving forward when it comes to future conversations about our beliefs, our doctrines, and our history. We do need to acknowledge that in both directions, there have been infractions, improprieties, and violations against one another. But if we are going to move past those things, let's demonstrate it by how we regard one another and how we talk these things out in a way that is honest, but seeks truth and love, and ultimately the exaltation of Christ as the way, the truth, and the life, and how important that is in these conversations, how that is ultimately the understanding that we all need to come to through these conversations. So, if you like this video, hit the thumbs up. Check out the resources I put in the description below. You can subscribe to the channel. Check this video out on Patreon for an extended cut, but you don't have to. You can just keep coming back here for more videos. We'll continue the conversations, and until next time, I'll see you later, Saints.